Good evening. I'm Dino Dave, and I will say I'm excited to be able to be with you folks for the creation investigation over the next few days. I've been looking forward to it. Just a little bit of background. As a young man, I always loved science, especially, my friends, the dinosaurs. And then as I got a little bit older, I was able to go to college and major in physics, and eventually, sometime later, earn a master's degree in biology. But it's been a joy to be able to travel around and speak on the topics of the origins debate, creation, evolution, science in the Bible, and especially, my friends, the dinosaurs. My personal area of research is the evidence that men and dinosaurs coexisted. And we have a website, Genesis Park, www.genesispark.com, where we like to say dinosaurs are living evidence of a powerful creator. We'll talk a little bit more about that in our upcoming sessions. But this is a session where we're going to be talking specifically on the evidence that there is a God. My wife and I live in New Hampshire, and we find ourselves here tonight not too far from Boston. And I'm told statistically that New England, this region, has the least amount of church attendance in the United States. That is, it's the most irreligious portion of the country. And so tonight's really a pertinent topic. That is, how do we, as Christians, as followers of Jesus Christ, engage a community round about us that's increasingly irreligious, perhaps pagan, perhaps agnostic, perhaps even atheistic? And so our topic tonight is answering atheists. Each of our sessions we'll begin with God's Word. And our jumping off place for tonight is the book of Peter. 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 15. You're welcome to follow along in your copy of God's Word, but I will have the verses mostly up on the overhead. And so you can just look there. But 1 Peter chapter 3 verse 15 says this, "But sanctify the Lord God in your hearts, and be ready always to give an answer to every man that asks you a reason of the hope that is in you with meekness and fear." Now, this is a two-part command. We can see the first part very readily there, where the command says to be ready to have an answer. And we're hopefully going to help tonight in providing some answers, some things that perhaps you might be able to utilize as you have conversations in the workplace or with neighbors or even perhaps family members. But do you see the second part of the command there? Sometimes we overlook that part. It's not just to have an answer, but how we're to answer. You see that? We're to answer with meekness and fear. So it's the way that we answer as well as having an answer that is of concern to God here in 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 15. Sometimes when folks figure out what they deem to be the truth, they can get very arrogant, condescending, dismissive, and that's not the attitude that we're to have as Christians. We're always supposed to think, you know what? At one point, I didn't have my eyes open to the truth. And I need to be patient with those that are perhaps working through this or don't yet have their eyes open to it. And so that's very important. And hopefully you won't get from me that kind of arrogant, condescending attitude as we talk about the atheists and agnostics and evolutionists. Here's our outline for this evening. We're going to talk about what is an atheist. We'll talk about the influence of atheism. Then we're going to spend some time and go through several key arguments for the existence of God. And then finally, we'll wrap it up pretty quickly with that last point. What are the practical implications for us as Christians? So let's ask this question. What is an atheist? Perhaps somebody can help me out. Who has a definition they can share? What is an atheist? Back here? Yes. Someone that doesn't believe in God. Someone who posits the non-existence of God. The word comes from the Greek, and if you're familiar with Greek, the A is a negative in the Greek. It kind of negates whatever comes after that. So, atheos, or no God. It's someone that actually believes there is no God. Now, here's a question. Are there any real atheists? Perhaps you've heard the quote, "There's no such thing as an atheist in a foxhole." And what seems to happen is when push comes to shove and times get hard enough, maybe some atheists seem to have second thoughts on it. But there are certainly plenty of people that claim to be atheists at any rate. How about this question? This one might be a little more controversial. Are atheists religious? I see some people nodding their heads. Some maybe not so convinced. On the one hand, you say, well, they don't believe in a God, so how could they be religious? But on the other hand, what is religion? Is it not a belief system that's taken on faith? Right at the beginning, if you're going to say there is no God, that's a universal negative, something that cannot be proven. You haven't been everywhere in the universe. You certainly haven't been outside the universe. And yet you want to believe firmly that there is no God up there. That is a position of faith. It's also a position that impacts morals and beliefs about the future. And so we would say atheists are religious. In fact, here's the Humanist Manifesto written all the way back in 1933. And the first tenet is this: religious, notice that word, religious humanists regard the universe as self-existing and not created. And the tenet number 2 is humanism believes that man is part of nature and that he has emerged as a result of a continuous process. What's that continuous process they're talking about there? Evolution, right? And so, right from the beginning, they call themselves religious humanists. Well, here's a question you might have puzzled on before. Why doesn't the Bible argue for the existence of God? Maybe right in Genesis chapter 1. It just starts off, in the beginning, God. Well, hang on a minute. How do we even know there was a God? Prove that. Well, we know later on in Romans chapter 1 and some other places, the Bible gives some of the evidences for the existence of God. And we're going to talk about some of those. But can I suggest something to you? I believe everybody in their heart of hearts starts off knowing there's a God. And then over time, perhaps they become blinded to it. Perhaps they choose to believe what they know is false. And I think that might be why the Bible says this in Psalm 14, verse 1, the fool has said in his heart, there is no God. My friends, I'm not calling people a fool. I'm just telling you what the Bible says. I had a friend, this was many years ago, and his job was to travel around the country. Large corporation, multi-billion-dollar corporation employed him, and his job was to travel around and exclusively administer polygraph lie detector tests to prospective employees. And so he'd go around, and as part of your employment application, he'd come in and he'd do a polygraph, and he'd ask questions like, have you ever stolen from an employer, and this type of thing. Well, this friend of mine was a Christian, and he made it a habit as he was preparing the equipment and getting things set up. You see what they do, something that's called establishing a baseline. And so they'll plug you into the equipment, and then they'll begin to ask you real obvious questions. Is your name Dino Dave? Are you wearing a green camouflage outfit, like as if you were an explorer? Do you live in New Hampshire? Now, these are obvious questions. Why would they be asking those? Well, they're trying to establish a little bit of a baseline as the machine just kind of does its ups and downs, and then they'll ask the more difficult questions. And if it goes flying off the baseline, they'll say, a lie. We caught you. And he would ask this question for prospective candidates. He would say, do you believe in God? Now, that would seem like a controversial question. And here's what he said. I never asked the question where they said no, that the machine didn't go off the wall and prove him a liar. I think everybody in their heart of hearts knows there's a God, and they have to turn away from that knowledge and become blinded to it. The fool has said in his heart, there is no God. Here are some philosophies that are similar to atheism. We could call them kissing cousins, if you will. You might hear some of these terms, and certainly they'd be pretty close. But agnostics aren't going to be quite so adamant there is no God. They'd rather say, well, we're just not convinced. I don't know if there's a God or if there isn't a God. I haven't seen any compelling evidence there's a God. They understand that, well, you can't prove a universal negative, and it's not terribly scientific to take a position like that, so they may be a little bit more sophisticated about it, and they'll say, well, I just don't know. Then there's the naturalists, and the naturalists would come along and say this, that no supernatural should be allowed in science. So we're not saying definitively there's no God, but we're saying that we can't have a creation or a design model allowed into the scientific arena. We have to assume there's no God. We have to move forward as if everything has to be explained with naturalistic mechanisms. Then there's the humanists, and they'll say man is the ultimate. If there's a God, it's us. Remember the religious humanists? This is a philosophical religious position. Then there's the rationalists. The old-time rationalists, going all the way back to the late 1800s, they'd say, if it isn't understandable to me, it's false. And so they'd get real critical of things like, the miracles in the Bible. And they'd talk about how, well, that's just not scientifically possible, so therefore we're not going to believe those portions of the Bible. Never occurred to them that, hey, listen, if God made the world, certainly he can break these laws of nature at any time he wishes, either to make a point or just to change things to his liking. Then there's the modernists. And the modernists say science and philosophical thought should supersede the scriptures. And there's lots of modernist churches out there, and they'll say, well, we kind of, we'll read the Bible a little bit, but that's not our ultimate authority. We'll hold to science. We'll hold to philosophical thought. We'll kind of mix it all up a little bit with all three of these things. And but when push comes to shove, science trumps the scriptures. And so these are folks that are similar in some of their philosophies, and obviously you might hear some of these words out there. Well, let's switch to this next topic, and that is the influence of atheism. The influence of atheism. Now, it might surprise you to hear that atheists in the United States of America are less than 15% of the population. When I first started doing these presentations, so some years ago, a couple decades ago, they were less than 10%. So it's actually grown quite a bit in the last recent decades. Part of that is because of the new atheists. Probably the leading one, most famous atheist in the world being Richard Dawkins, wrote this book called The God Delusion. The God Delusion was a best-selling book for a number of years on college campuses. And some of the novelty of the new atheists have passed, but a lot of people followed after them. It became quite vogue, became cool to be an atheist, especially on college campuses. But even still today, less than 15% of the population. But here's something that's important. The atheists are very active in the arenas that set the philosophical agenda, particularly in the scientific leadership. Let me back that up with a statistic. Here is Neil deGrasse Tyson, and he says, quote, I want to put on the table, 85% of the members of the National Academy of Sciences reject God. Notice this is the flip opposite of the population at large. 85% believe in some kind of a God, 15% are straight up atheists. But when you look at the leadership in scientific circles, 85% agnostics and atheists, and only 15% believe in a personal God. Now that's pretty interesting because the folks at the National Academy of Sciences, these are the folks that write the textbooks. These are the folks that, get interviewed when you're looking for a scientist to get interviewed on, Nature or National Geographic quotes or something like this. These are the folks that are teaching in the colleges, teaching the teachers. They're the leadership. And we have 85% atheists and agnostics. So it shouldn't surprise you why we end up with the textbooks we do and why we end up with the teachers that we end up with in our public school systems. The English, or the British equivalent of the National Academy of Sciences, they're called the Fellows of the Royal Society, and they come from various countries, not just Britain, but also Canada, Australia, New Zealand, India, and they're elected by their peers, much like the National Academy of Sciences. And perhaps it'll surprise you, maybe it won't, but a poll of these Fellows of the Royal Society found that only 3.3% of the Fellows believe in a personal God. So the situation is a lot more dramatic even in Europe and in some of these other countries. Now I want to take a step backwards in time. Here is Professor Watson, and this is way back in the 1920s. And he was a leading biologist at the time, one of the science writers of his day, and he demonstrated his atheistic bias and the bias behind much of evolutionary thinking when he said this, quote, evolution is a theory universally accepted not because it can be proven by logically coherent evidence to be true, but because the only alternative, special creation, is clearly incredible. Question, is Professor Watson saying I'm an atheist or I'm an evolutionist because the evidence has been overwhelming? No, he's not saying that. What's he saying? He's saying, I don't want to be a creationist, so therefore I choose to believe evolution. Now, this is important. This has always been the case. This is kind of important right at the outset here, because at the end of the day, primarily, it's not an issue of convincing one's intellect that there is a God. It's that these folks don't want to believe there's a God. It's a heart issue. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't give reasonable responses or have arguments in favor of God. I'm going to give you some. And I think we should be prepared, as 1 Peter 3:15 says, to have an answer for the issues of our time. But understand, at the end of the day, it's not about winning a rational argument. At the end of the day, it's a heart decision about whether somebody's willing to submit themselves to God. And when they have a priori rejected that willingness to bend the knee to a deity, it doesn't matter how much evidence is accumulated, they're not going to be persuaded because it's a heart issue. I just want to put that out there. I think that's important. Okay, let's talk about some of the evidence for the existence of God. I want to give you a handful of big words here, but you folks are a sharp crowd. I know you can handle this, but I'm going to give you 5 big words. The first one is cosmological. Cosmological. The effect of the universe's existence, think cosmos, must have a suitable cause. The effect of the universe's existence must have a suitable cause. You see, we live in a cause and effect world. You perhaps heard this way back in high school science. Every action demands an equal and opposite reaction, right? This is probably the most fundamental of all scientific laws. That is, we look for some regularity, cause and effect. Even a baby learns this, that if you take this and put it in this, there is a effect, right? Cause and effect. And the effect is pain. You might get a baby that's stubborn enough to try it twice. They won't try it a third time. Cause and effect. So we live in a cause and effect world. It's one of the most fundamental of all scientific laws. So we have to ask ourselves, where did this all come from? What chicken laid this egg? Now, if you ask an evolutionist where did it all come from, how are they going to respond? What are they going to say? The Big Bang. Very good. So you have, Dino Dave, you have a Big Bang. And there was this huge explosion which created the entire universe, the fabric of space and time, and the stars, and eventually cooling globs of matter that would eventually kind of go around them and be some of the planets and maybe even moons and different things and form all these galaxies. It all came out of this Big Bang. But remember what we were talking about a minute ago, we live in a cause and effect world. So we shouldn't stop asking the question, where did it all come from, at that point of a Big Bang? So you say, well, okay, well, things don't just explode by themselves. I mean, let's say we're walking down the street and, you know, you and I, and we're talking, and all of a sudden a building explodes, and you say, whoa, did you see that, Dino Dave? I said, well, don't worry about that. It's not a big deal. It happens sometimes. You know, just don't worry about it. Bad day for that building. It's okay. What? No, we don't want buildings to explode. We want to find out what was the cause for that explosion. Was somebody playing with chemistry in the basement? Was it a terrorist attack? Was it poorly built, maybe kind of imploded? I mean, what happened? We've got to know, because we don't want buildings exploding. It doesn't just happen. There's a reason, there's a cause for that explosion. And if you ask that question, well, where'd the Big Bang come from? A lot of times folks will get kind of a weird look on your face, like you're not supposed to ask that question. Sometimes you'll get somebody that's studied some particle physics, and they'll say something like, well, there was this vapor cloud, and the condensation of the vapor cloud created the Big Bang. Now, if they say that, what should you say? Where'd the vapor cloud come from, right? You guys are catching the idea. And you can keep playing this game all day long, and eventually you're only going to come up with 3 possibilities. Now, I've done this presentation in multiple foreign countries and all over the United States, and I've never had anybody suggest to me there's anything but these 3 possibilities. Possibility number 1 as to where it all came from is this. Spontaneous generation. Spontaneous generation. That is, there was absolutely nothing, and then poof, we got everything. You might say, well, do people really believe that? Oh, yeah, they do. Here is Physical Geology, college-level textbook. I quote, according to the Big Bang Theory, the universe blinked mind you, blinked violently into existence 13.77 billion years ago. You may wonder how a universe can be created out of nothing, or how we know the Big Bang happened at all. Creating a universe out of nothing is mostly beyond the scope of this chapter. Yeah, I would say that'd be a tough thing to try to deal with in a physical geology textbook chapter, wouldn't it? Here is Lawrence Krauss's book, A Universe from Nothing, best-selling book. He says modern science has now made it plausible that space, time, matter, energy, and even universe can emerge from nothing. Stephen Hawking is a very famous author, not too long ago deceased, but he said in his book, Brief Answers to Big Questions, thanks to the Big Bang, you can get a whole universe for free because the fantastically enormous universe of space and energy can materialize out of nothing. Now, my friends, that's the ultimate free lunch right there, isn't it? Get the whole universe for nothing. Here is physicist Paul Davies. He says this, the Big Bang represents the instantaneous suspension of physical laws, the sudden, abrupt flash of lawlessness that allowed something to come out of nothing. It represents a true miracle. Whoa. It represents a true miracle transcending physical principles. Now, hang on a minute. I thought the big problem the atheists had with the Bible and allowing it into a science classroom to talk about creation model, we can't have that. Why? Because of the miracles, the supernatural. We can only have natural explanations. Oh, but it's okay to have a miracle when we need it for the Big Bang? Do you see the inconsistency here just a little bit? How is this more scientific than in the beginning God created? You see, my friends, this is a position of absolute faith. Nowhere in the universe do we see planets, galaxies popping into existence. It doesn't happen. People say, oh, well, we may see particles kind of coming in and out of existence. Folks, that's just the fabric of the universe, kind of like waves coming in and out of existence on an ocean. But we don't see matter on a macroscopic level coming in. This is a position of faith, not observable science. Well, if you don't like spontaneous generation, there's a second possibility, and that is eternality of matter. That is, matter in some form has always been there. Whether it's a vapor cloud or whether it's the Big Bang or whether it's a universe kind of like we know it. This was very popular in the Middle Ages, and actually it was Aristotle's view, and he was influential in the Renaissance. He said the cosmos is in a steady state, eternal, unique, and all-inclusive. The universe as a whole is ungenerated as well as being indestructible. Remember what the Humanist Manifesto says? Religious humanists regard the universe as self-existing and not created. So it just kind of has always existed. Some of you folks are old enough here to remember the original Cosmos show. And here's Carl Sagan, and he famously would say, the cosmos is all that is, or ever was, or ever will be. And he, of course, is a famous atheist. But there's a problem with this idea, with this view, and that is that we have some of our most well-established science is the laws of thermodynamics. And the laws of thermodynamics, especially the second law of thermodynamics, makes this very difficult to say, well, the universe has always been there, because things tend to go from order to disorder. That is, we have to put in energy to make and create order, and if we walk away all by itself, through the laws of thermodynamics, things tend to go to a least ordered state, at least energetic state. When water runs downhill, the sun will eventually burn out. And, we have all the systems, even the Earth's spin, we're slowing, and the magnetic field's going down, and the moon's gradually, retreating from the Earth. And these systems are falling apart. They're falling apart. And so if what we observe is things winding down, well, what wound it up? It can't always have been that way. Or if it had been that way, then it would have already wound down to the point where there wouldn't be any energy left. It would be a flat, dead universe. And so it's a problem. The laws of thermodynamics, or the law of degeneration, says this just can't be going on forever. Something at some point put the energy in and wound it up. So spontaneous generation violates the law of cause and effect. Eternality of matter violates the laws of thermodynamics. There's only one other option, and that is some form of intelligent design. Intelligent design. Now, this doesn't tell you who the designer is. All it's doing is saying that whoever made the space-mass-time continuum must themselves exist outside time and have put the energy into it and started it off at a discrete point in time. Intelligent design. That's the only three possibilities. That one does not violate any known scientific laws. They might say, well, Dino Dave, we can't see God creating something, so that's still a position of faith. Absolutely. Absolutely. But here's my point. The others are equally positions of faith, aren't they? Though they might not like to admit it, but they are. We don't observe a Big Bang. It's scientifically illogical to think of matter being eternal. Now, sometimes when I do this presentation, particularly in colleges, but sometimes in public schools, I'll get somebody to come along and they'll say something like this. Okay, Dino Dave, where did God come from then? In other words, you want to say, it doesn't make sense for the universe to be eternal. Okay. Well, wait a minute. Who made God? In fact, Richard Dawkins, in his nasty little book, The God Delusion, has a whole chapter on that. And he thinks just by asking that question, he's pretty much disproved God. He says, if the universe, which is by all accounts less complicated and less grand than God, is difficult to explain by just kind of coming along, well, you got an even bigger issue. Well, who made God, right? Now, if someone asks that question, how do we respond? He's always been there. Okay. And that's true. I mean, God is eternal, but are we in a different position from those that would hold to the eternality of matter, or are we pretty much in the same boat? Do we have a stronger basis to be in, whereas the eternality of matter violates the laws of thermodynamics? Do we have a more logically coherent position than those that would just believe, well, the universe is eternal and you believe God is eternal? Let me suggest something to you. The reason we ask, where did that come from? 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 Is because we live in a cause and effect world. Is God bound by the laws that he created? No, God is not in a cause and effect universe, right? By all accounts, God is supernatural. That is, he exists outside of the natural world that he created. And he created it with certain laws, and he created it with the law of cause and effect, and he created it with the laws of thermodynamics, and he created it with, laws of gravity and on and on and on. But God himself exists outside of it. And so he is not bound by the law of cause and effect. You see, if you want to say that there is no supernatural, okay, there's no God, there's no supernatural whatsoever, then think about the universe being a big box, and it's bound by these natural laws, and there's nothing outside the box. And so you have a problem because you have to explain everything in your model of origins by the laws of the box. I don't have that problem because God is outside the box. So it's not the least bit illogical to say he's eternal. Does that make sense? Unlike saying the universe is eternal, which is problematic and violates the known laws of science. Psalm 19, verse 1 says it this way: the heavens declare The glory of God. The firmament shows his handiwork. The cosmological argument. Well, we have to hurry along here to our next big word, and that is the teleological argument. The teleological argument says this: the design of the universe implies a purpose or direction behind it. Now, this isn't so much about where the universe came from, but how did it get to be the way that it is? See, we can envision lots of different universes. We can envision a universe where things are very random, where perhaps I took this book by Richard Dawkins and I dropped it 100 times, and 99 times out of 100 gravity held and it went down, but 1 in 100 it would just kind of float off into space. Unpredictable worlds. Well, you can't do science in a world like that. You can't establish scientific laws. I'm not sure you could actually live in a universe like that. People just flying off like, where'd Charlie go? What? It just, the odds came up against him and he just disappeared. But no, our universe is designed. It's purposeful. It's ordered. Things are repeatable. That's how we can do science. That's why science flourished in a Christian worldview. Unlike worldviews where they believed that natural phenomenon like lightning and thunder was, well, you said the gods were having an argument up there and they're having a fight, and so this was the ramifications. Well, then you can't make predictions because you never know when their gods are going to have an argument. But if you believe in an orderly creator the way the Bible lays it out, then you have reason to be able to expect that the scientific method would hold sway, and we can do science the way that we did. And so this idea of teleological, you ask questions like this: why is the universe rational? Why does it operate under laws that permit scientific pursuit? For example, is the ideal environment for life on earth the product of a mindless chance? Give a simple illustration of this. Here's the sun, right? And here's the earth, and we're spinning around the sun. Well, what if the earth in its orbit was just a little bit closer to the sun? What would happen? We'd be crispy critters, right? What if we were just a little bit further out? We would be popsicles, right? So this is Goldilocks zone, and things have to be just right. And that's just one tiny example of literally dozens of things that have to be just right about our universe in order to even have life. And what are the odds that all those are going to come out just right out of a Big Bang? Do you think that's what explains it? I don't have that much faith. You see, the universe is extremely fine-tuned for life even to exist. I have here a dictionary. This is a Webster's dictionary. What if I told you the way I got this dictionary was kind of unique? I got this as a result of an explosion in a print shop. Oh, you're starting to laugh out there. No, wait, hang on a minute. Let's hear my story. So I was looking out my window one time, and I looked down a couple blocks, and all of a sudden, boom, there's this huge explosion, and it's a print shop, and I walked down to see if everybody's okay, and there wasn't anybody in there, so everybody was fine. It wasn't a problem. But out of that explosion came my Webster's Unabridged Dictionary. Now you're still laughing at me. What's wrong with my story? You're not going to get order out of an explosion. But my friend, you've got everything you need for the dictionary right there in that print shop. You've got the ink, you've got the glue, the binding, you've got the paper. Everything you need is right there. All we have to do is give it some energy, right? And boom, you should be able to create a dictionary, right? Now, we just kind of inherently know that's not going to happen. You can explode a print shop billions, trillions, however many times. It's not going to happen. Why? Because there's such a degree of orderliness, and we can just inherently know that that kind of sophistication and purposefulness doesn't come from an explosion. That's why we drop bombs on these terrorist tanks, right? Not because we want to randomize the tank and make it a little bit better, but because we want to randomize the tank and destroy it. And hopefully the bad little terrorist in the tank as well. Explosions don't create order. Now, this is a quote from Stephen Hawking, his book, The Illustrated Brief History of Time. Why did the universe start out with so nearly the critical rate of expansion that it's still expanding at nearly the critical rate? He says, if the rate of the expansion 1 second after the Big Bang had been smaller by even 1 part in 100,000 million, whoa, the universe would have recollapsed before it reached its present size. And my friends, what if I came up to you and said, listen, you're not going to believe this, but I won the lottery 100 times in a row. I mean, do you know anybody that's won the lottery? I don't. I mean, some people do win it. But if you won it twice in a row, the FBI would open an investigation. Because it's impossible, right? And yet I want to explain to you that I won it 100 times in a row. Look, if I did win it 100 times in a row, that would absolutely scientifically prove that I cheated. It was rigged. And I'm telling you that the birth of the universe was rigged. I don't have enough faith to believe something like that happens by chance. It's not credible. It's not realistic. It doesn't hold together. Here is a great quote from the New Scientist. This is a journal, science journal. And this is fairly recent, 2009. You might think these disparate bodies, talking about these planets around our solar system, these disparate bodies are scattered across the solar system without rhyme or reason. But move any piece of the solar system today or try to add anything more, and the whole construction would be thrown fatally out of kilter. So how exactly did this delicate architecture come to be? Great question. And so the atheists want to say, well, you know, it's amazing. It's just a very fortunate accident. I don't have enough faith to believe that, my friends. Creationists, design theorists, would look at that exact same evidence. Not like we have different evidence from the atheists, it's just how we interpret the evidence. And we're going to say, no, incredible design, there must be a great designer. Romans chapter 1, verse 20, literally centuries ago, put it this way: for the invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so they're without excuse. God is seen by just looking at the orderly universe round about us. Nobody will ever be able to stand before God someday and say, well, God, I just had to become an atheist because there wasn't enough evidence for your existence. God will say, no. There's no excuse. There's no excuse. Okay, ready for big word number 3? Anthropological. So we talked about cosmological, teleological, anthropological. And the anthropological argument is this: the innate awareness of a higher moral law and truth signifies that there is a meaning to life. This built-in, this innate awareness of a higher moral law and the existence of truth. You see, one of the most common arguments that I've heard out there from people that don't believe in God, and they may not be, adamant in your face atheists, but they just say, I just don't believe there's a God. And I say, well, why? What brought you to that position? They'll say, well, there's so much injustice. There's so much injustice in this world. I just can't believe that there's a God that would allow that. And oftentimes they'll cite some personal experience that was maybe traumatic and kind of a turning point for them in their philosophical journey. And they may say something like this: either God must be all-powerful, must not be all-powerful, or he must not be good. For if he was good, he wouldn't want this to happen. And if he was all-powerful, he wouldn't allow it to happen. So either he's not good or he's not all-powerful. So I don't believe there's a God out there, at least not like the Christian God. Now, C.S. Lewis was an atheist at one point, brilliant philosopher and historian. And C.S. Lewis said this: as an atheist, he was forced to ask, how had I gotten this idea of just and unjust? In other words, you say the world's full of injustice. Okay. Where did you get this idea that the world is unjust? C.S. Lewis says, a man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing the universe with when I called it unjust? Where does this idea of justice and injustice come from? C.S. Lewis said, well, I could have given up the idea of justice by saying it was nothing but a private idea of my own. So it's just something that you kind of thought of as a nice thing, and somebody else has their opinion, someone else has their opinion. But he went on to say, if I did that, then my argument against God collapsed too. For the argument depended on saying the world was really unjust, not simply that it did not happen to please my private fancies. So if justice and injustice is merely something that's come along that we've kind of agreed on as a society, or maybe we've evolved to the point of thinking about justice and injustice and cruelty and kindness, and these concepts have just kind of come along, morality is coalesced in our thinking, well, then how can we hold that up and say, well, God is not just? It's just our private interpretation. And so if there is real injustice, then we have to say there was justice, and we have to ask where that comes from. Evolutionists have tried to push the idea that humans are nothing but a moist robot, pure materialism, but this materialism doesn't square with our human experience. If we are nothing but a cosmic accident, why should we trust what seems to us to be rational? We lose all sense of meaning. Here's Bertrand Russell, famous atheist, brilliant man. And he says, man's origin, his growth, his hopes, his fears, his loves, his beliefs are but the outcome of an accidental collocation of atoms. He's saying, there's no such thing as love or heroism. It's just how the atoms are bouncing around in your brain. See? That's how you get the idea of justice and injustice. But if that's the case, how can we even trust what we think is rational? Here's Michael Behe, and Michael Behe is a design theorist, and he responds to the atheists by saying, those who declare they have no mind, are not intelligent, conscious, or free, are hardly in a position to reason about any topic, let alone the state of mind they deny having. Even Charles Darwin had difficulty with this concept. In a letter to William Graham back in 1881, Charles Darwin wrote this, but then with me, the horrid doubt always arises whether the convictions of a man's mind, which have been developed from the mind of the lower animals, are of any value or at all trustworthy. Would anyone trust in the convictions of a monkey's mind, if there are any convictions in such a mind? And Darwin's beginning to doubt his own thinking. If my thinking is just a bunch of random chemistry moving around, there's no purpose, everything is a complete accident, everything is random, why would I argue this is rational and that's irrational? How could I trust my own mind? Well, there is right and wrong. There is morality. There is justice. There is injustice. And of course, the Bible explains how injustice came to be. We live in a cursed world because of man's sin. Romans 1:19 says, because that which may be known of God is manifest where? In them. It's called conscience. For God has showed it to them. Okay, we need to keep on moving here. We have number 4 of our big words, the ontological argument. This argument goes this way. The implanted idea of God in the conscious soul points to the supernatural. The implanted idea of God in the conscious soul. Let me ask a question. Why do we have a soul? At what point in the evolutionary process did a soul slip in? You see, here's a tree, right? This is just a good old tree, and this tree has a physical presence. It has a body. It's doing biological functions, right? Now, if I took a chainsaw and sort of cut down this tree, would it say ouch? No, it's just going to go plop, right? Now, how about this fella here? If I started cutting on him, would he say ouch? Well, he's going to say something, right? You see, there's something different going on there than what we have in the tree. More than just a physical presence, he's got a brain. He feels pain. There's something different between that animal and that tree. But can I suggest to you that no ape has ever built an altar? No dog has ever said, where am I coming from? Where am I going after I die? No dolphin has ever said, I wonder if this is morally correct or whether this is immoral. There's something fundamentally different inside man, and we call it a soul. Here is neurosurgeon Michael Egner. He makes a startling comment. He says, we are more different from apes than apes are from viruses. Whoa. I thought like we were very closely related to the great apes. Egner goes on to say, our difference is a metaphysical chasm. Systems of taxonomy that emphasize physical and genetic similarities and ignore the fact that human beings are capable of abstract thought and contemplation of moral law and eternity are pitifully inadequate to describe man. You know, when you just look at physical shape or just biological systems, yes, there's a lot of things that we share with all other mammals. And of all the mammals, it would seem that apes are the closest in physical similarities to us. But how can you ignore morality, consciousness? How can you ignore this vast chasm that separates us from any other animal? This next quote is perhaps my favorite of the lot. This is a quote from an atheist named Jesse Bering. Watch this. This is really insightful. Jesse says this, as a way of thinking, God is an inherent part of our natural cognitive systems, and ridding ourselves of him, really thoroughly, permanently removing him from our heads would require a neurosurgeon, not a science teacher. Jesse's saying, I just wish I could get rid of God. He's stuck inside my brain. I can't get rid of him. We have a soul. This God-shaped vacuum inside us. Blaise Pascal said, what else does this craving, this helplessness proclaim? But there was once in man a true happiness, of which all that now remains is an empty print and trace. This infinite abyss can be filled only with an infinite and immutable object, in other words, by God himself. Scientists have been trying to understand what goes on between our ears, trying to understand consciousness and where thoughts arise and how the wiring works inside there. During the last 4 decades, an exciting exploration for our inner space, or what we commonly call the mind, has been going on. But researchers in the field of cognition are still struggling to understand how the mind's qualities spring from living tissue and electrical impulses. Souls and synapses are hard to reconcile. Souls and synapses are hard to reconcile. That's a quote from a master's level biology textbook. Why do we have a soul? Even Richard Dawkins, in his nasty little book, The God Delusion, says this on page 168. After he talks about the unlikelihood of life coming from non-life, he makes this comment: the origin of consciousness might be another major gap whose bridging was of the same order of improbability. Why is consciousness a problem for evolutionist atheist Richard Dawkins? Perhaps I could illustrate. Let's just say everybody on this side of the room, your right, my left, are carnivores. Now, you guys know you are. You guys know that you like pepperoni and sausage. You like some dead animals on your pizza. These are the carnivores. They got the nasty claws. They got the sharp teeth. Everybody on this side of the room, they're nice, fuzzy little herbivores. And I'll count myself over in this side here. And of course, the herbivores, even though we eat grass and we're nice and all that, still, according to evolutionists, we've got to where we are by a beneficial mutation coming along to one individual, and that person being able to get more plants and more grass than his fellows, and perhaps even have more spouses and leave more offspring. And so by literally stepping on and getting ahead of the others is how evolution's happened and how this wonderful population of herbivores has gotten to be the way it is. And now let's just say, I've got a friend here in the front row. Daniel, can you just stand up for a minute? I'll just pick on him just because I know him. He's a good sport here. And let's just say, of all the herbivores over here, my friend Daniel is the first to get a mutation for consciousness. Everybody else is just stepping on each other. But Daniel is over here. He's off to the side saying, what's right and what's wrong? I wonder what's going to happen when we pass from this world. And he's contemplating some of this stuff. While everybody else is just trying to get ahead and get the most grass and the vegetables for themselves, Daniel's asking these kinds of questions, which just by itself should allow him to be quickly selected against in the struggle for existence. But all of a sudden we look over the hill and here come these nasty carnivores. And we're scared because they got nasty claws and sharp teeth, and I'm scared too, right? So we all start running for the forest as fast as we can because they're going to eat us, right? And all of a sudden, I'm running, and Dino Dave trips and goes down hard. I break my leg. Everybody else looks back and says, "Oh, poor Dino Dave, tough luck on you," and they're gone, except for my friend Dan. Dan looks back and says, "Oh, poor Dino Dave," and he comes along, picks me up. "Come on, Dino Dave, we got this." Well, what's going to happen to him? He's going to be dinner. Thank you, Daniel, for letting me pick on you. You see, there is no evolutionary benefit to having consciousness, none. And it causes heart pain to Richard Dawkins and keeps him up at nights. Why do we have a soul? Well, Genesis chapter 2, verse 7 tells why. The Lord God formed man out of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul. There's one more argument that I don't have time to develop tonight. We've got to wrap things up here, but it's the scriptural argument. You see that Bible that many of you hold in your lap, some of us have on our app, is a miracle. I have a whole session on this, so I'm not going to belabor it, but we could talk about the historical evidence, the scientific evidence, the fulfilled prophecies, the uniqueness of the book, the changed lives. The Bible, the scripture, is also a key argument that there must be a God behind this incredible, life-transforming book. So there you have it. 5 key arguments: the cosmological, teleological, anthropological, ontological, and scriptural. Now, we've been kind of technical. We've gone a little bit deep, maybe perhaps even a bit dry. And you might be saying, Dino Dave, that was good, a little cerebral, but does it really matter to me? Does it matter to me standing here tonight? Does apologetics really matter? I'm going to suggest to you it does. First off, by command. We talked about 1 Peter 3:15, but Colossians 4:5-6 says this: "Let your speech be always with grace, seasoned with salt, that you may know how you ought to answer every man." So we are obliged to be able to address the issues of our society round about us. Now, the sad thing is, many atheists, evolutionists, agnostics, are engaged in the argument in the public forum, and too few Christians even care. Here is Richard Bozarth, and Richard Bozarth, writing in The American Atheist, said, I quote, "Christianity has fought, still fights, and will continue to fight science to the desperate end over evolution, because evolution destroys utterly and finally the very reason Jesus' earthly life was supposedly made necessary." Bozarth goes on to say, "Destroy Adam and Eve and the original sin. In the rubble, you'll find the sorry remains of the Son of God." What this all means is Christianity cannot lose the Genesis account of creation, for Christianity is fighting for its very life. Christianity is fighting for its very life. Here's a guy that gets it. He understands there's a fight on. He understands there's a battle. It's raging for the souls of mankind. Each of us has a post in that battle. Each of us has a place where God has allowed us. You have a place that's different from my place. Oh, perhaps the folks in your workplace will never meet your pastor, never meet me. But God has put you there. That's your post. Your family, your neighbors, your workplace is your mission field. Are you engaged in the battle? Or are we just off picking daisies? Are we just like living as if this is all there's ever going to be forever, as opposed to this life is short? And we have to be on point for Jesus Christ, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. I like this little cartoon figurine. This is put up by my friends at Answers in Genesis. And it shows this battle that's happening. And over here you have the atheists and the evolutionists, and they're fighting, and they're aiming their big guns at the creation and God's Word, the foundational principles. And here you have Christians. Some of the Christians are blowing up their own foundation. Others are just shooting off into space, totally irrelevant as to what's really going on. Some of them are asleep at the switch. Some of them are aiming up here at some of these peripheral issues, which Okay, I agree that these things are bad and we need to be concerned about things like crime and immorality and drugs and abortion. But while occasionally somebody ends up doing a little good, there's all kinds of people that are blowing up balloons and it's going faster than we can possibly keep up. Some of them are over here and they're aiming their big guns at their buddies saying, you know what? I don't like you. And that's where all the energy is going into. And so few of us are actually aiming at the root issues. Psalm chapter 11, verse 3 says, if the foundations be destroyed, what can the righteous do? You wonder why we have a confused society? It's because we have left the foundation of God's word. You wonder why people are miserable and hopeless? Suicides at an all-time high amongst young people in our country. Mass shootings. We just had another one this last week. We've left our foundation of morality. We've left God. There are ramifications to becoming an irreligious pagan society, and we're seeing it all around about us. But my question for you is, are you engaged? Are you on point? What on earth are you doing for heaven's sake? What on earth are you doing for heaven's sake?